Buenos días, esta es una emisión, esta es una conversación de Phil Pensamiento y me da mucho gusto ser anfitrión de esta conversación que tendremos a partir de ahora en inglés y podrán ustedes seguirla en la traducción automática que verán ustedes en sus pantallas. Hi, good afternoon to everyone. We have the great pleasure of hosting a conversation to talk about what are the challenges that this historical event, that's the pandemic that we are all suffering throughout the world, poses to liberal democracies, to democratic participation, to representative structures. And we have a great panel with us. We have Donatella Della Porta, a renowned sociologist that has been studying throughout her whole life democracy and social movements, and that posed in 2013 a question that I think is one of the most pressing questions in the day. Can democracy survive? And I think that is somehow the perspective that we have in contemporary political discussions, that is somehow an apocalyptic perspective on democracy. If we see the main titles that we can read in contemporary politics, we can see all these titles: the death of democracy, democracy in crisis, democracies in crisis. So I would like to ask you first, Donatella, if you can present to us your perspective on these challenges that the health crisis in the world poses to contemporary democracies.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the invitation and thank you for this presentation. In fact, the questions, can democracy be saved, acquires new meaning and relevance during the pandemics. I think we should consider that pandemics appears as a sort of unique event, but in reality, it is part of a type of events that sociologists have addressed in the past. Is a sort of emergency time that is similar to times of natural catastrophe, but also of military wars. And what we have seen with this research is that war or catastrophe can produce disruption in democratic context, but they could also produce innovation. So, for instance, wars have been linked to growth in welfare states, even though they have been linked also to illiberal trends, also after the war is over. So I think that it is important to consider that these type of events are very open-ended. So times is very intensified. There is an urgency to act. There is a polarization. And what we see is that conflicts that were already there acquired new strength during the pandemics. So we also know from research that health challenges are also related with some specific characteristics. For instance, previous pandemics like AIDS pandemics had a different type of development. which is related with the characteristics of the victims, with the contagiousness of the virus, and so on. But also what we know is that there is a sort of trend in which pandemics follow different steps. They rise, they peak, and then they decline for different reasons. But also I think we have to consider that pandemics are influenced by some characteristics of the political system before the pandemics take strength. So pandemic, the specific pandemic of COVID 2019 has some characteristics that I think present specific challenges for democracy, but also that could open paths for positive transformations. The type of health crisis in which everybody can become a victim. It is widespread at the worldwide. It is a long-lasting process, and it happens in a moment which is already a moment of crisis for liberal democracy. So it is a moment in which, in rapid successions, we had financial crisis, then environmental crisis that became very evident, and a crisis of political responsibilities. That is, institutions, representative institutions, state institutions, were considered by the citizens as not performing well. And so we had declining in trust, and we had also attempt to from the electoral processes into different forms of political participation. So it was a moment in which already the democracy in the forms of liberal democracy was challenged. But there were also other type of challenges. So inequalities have been rising a lot inside countries and among countries. So-called neoliberal capitalism brought about an increase in inequalities and growing dissatisfaction. But there is also another challenge, which is increased by the pandemic, and it is related with illiberal trends in this democracy. There was once upon the time, at the beginning of neoliberal capitalism, the expectation that capitalism would probably attack social rights, but would be more libertarian in terms of civic rights. What we saw instead is that with the crisis of neoliberalism, with the financial crisis and so on, there was also a reduction of freedoms. So we had trends in some countries more, but in most countries of reductions of the check and balances, of scapegoating of some groups of people, of an attempt to use conservative values as a sort of way to move attention from social inequalities. There have been racism growing, and there have been right-wing populist leaders that have actively reduce freedoms. So defined as post-democracy in the sense of regimes that have reduced the capacity to intervene in order to grant citizens rights, but they are also illiberal type of democracy, with, in some cases, also the shift towards hybrid regimes of in countries even inside Europe and inside a democratic context. And what does the pandemic brings about in this context? We know, especially in the beginning, there has been a move toward the executive and reduced capacity of the parliaments to intervene. We know that many decisions have been taken in untransparent ways, under little disclosure of information. We know that in some cases there have been power of exceptions that have been in part contested, but that have been considered as going beyond the range of activities that is possible during emergencies. And this has been happening in several states, and this is an open debate in several states. There have been multiple forms of inequalities that have been exacerbated, increased, and became also more visible. So sense of injustice that was increased by the fact that the victims, in terms of contagion, but also in terms of the deadly consequences of the contagions, were especially the poor, some ethnic groups, the elderly, and so on. There have been perceptions that many crises tended to overlap. So that the health crisis has been produced and supported and increased by socioeconomic type of inequalities, and this produce in a vicious cycles more inequalities, and by the environmental crisis. So pollution has been also linked with the growth of the pandemic. And also there has been the perceptions that the pandemics have been more deadly by the cuts that have been introduced in the past in the welfare system, in the health system, and so on. There has been scapegoating of some groups, so that have been considered as most responsible for the pandemics, the ethnic minorities, the young people, the foreigners, the migrants, and so on. There has been what has been a sort of infodemic, so very bad communications path, which different forms of media, mass media and social media have scandalized the pandemics and provided fake news and more rarely true information. It's a time of uncertainty. Is also a time of increasing social fragmentation. So the differences between those who work in the public sectors and those who work instead in the autonomous sectors, in the services, in the tourism, and so on, became very relevant. Precarity versus the possession of a secure job also made a difference. So these are all challenges that I think are there and that could remain there also after solutions has been found from the health problems. On the other hand, just a few words. I think that like in other emergencies, catastrophes, and so on, there is still power of agency, and there is still a development in a situations in which civil societies and social movements, progressive actors had already been mobilized. So the pandemic happened, spread in the beginning of the years 2020. After, in the fall of 2019, broad movements spread around the world. Lebanon, Chile, Hong Kong are all examples of movements that had already mobilized in the name of solidarities, in the name of further democratizations, deepening of democracy or democratizations altogether. So it was a moment in which the people were, citizens were already mobilized, and in the pandemics, also progressive actors intervened a lot. So we have, since the beginning of the pandemics, rather an increase of social and political conflicts, but also an increase not only of protests in the streets, but also of civil society actors producing alternative knowledge and active in forms of new mutualism, so in solidarity with each other. Prefigurating alternative forms of democracy. Especially what we saw, similarly to what some scholars like Charles Tilly had suggested as an effect of some mobilizations during some wars, we also have discursive opportunities for change. So we have the spreading of the belief that the societies and politics as they were before were no longer working, and so that one needs to change. There are discursive opportunities for a return of the states and for a return of state interventions in reducing inequalities. Problems like racism have acquired new centrality and mobilized different groups in the population. I think also the recent development, for instance, in the United States with the elections, also testify for the fact that the pandemics brought about a demand for knowledge, a respect for science that has challenged some of the main discourses of right-wing populist leaders like Trump in the United States that had since the beginning disclaimed the value. This is an important type of transformations because it shows that a crisis could produce different type of developments according also to the different capacity of different actors to intervene. So we have challenges for those in power. We have challenges about liberal democracy, reflections on the role of expertise, on the role of communication, but on the role of civil societies. But I think we have also spaces that are opening up for different forms and conceptions and practices of democracy that are more oriented towards participations and potentially also deliberative capacity of producing new ideas and new type of actors. So this is what I wanted to say in this beginning, and then look
Thank you
forward
for such a
to
rich
the
perspective on the challenges, on the political challenges of the pandemic, and also to show us how the crisis of democracy precedes, obviously, the pandemic, and if it does something, is accelerate or radicalize the problems that we could have seen last year in the last several years. I'm really happy to hear now John Keane. We have heard him in Guadalajara before. He is well known in Mexico, basically because of his work on his biography of democracy, life and death of democracy, and also we have had a hint of his view on the political impact of the pandemic in an essay that Letras Libres translated some months ago, on democracy and the Great Plague. It was published in May of this year. So, John, thank you very much for being again in Guadalajara, even if we are connecting through these screens. But we are happy, we are really happy to hear your take on this issue.
Well, muchas gracias. And I would like to say buenas tardes to señoras y señores. Thank you very much for inviting me. And it's a great pleasure to join by the magic carpet of vMix to be with you across the Pacific. I wanted to begin my brief comments by agreeing very strongly with Donatella about this being a very strange period. The word crisis is but it's a very strange period of disruption and probable innovation, breakdowns and breakthroughs. And I think this raises the question of the broad head of how to think about this unprecedented pestilence. And I agree very much with Donatella that, and here a word from Albert Hirschman, fracassomania is to be avoided. You know, catastrophist thinking, fracassomania, the belief that everything is going badly, that everything is shit, that the world is going downhill rapidly. It is a much more complicated picture. On the anti-democratic side of developments, it is interesting that we do have a literature that teaches us about the ways in which pestilence brings out the worst of humanity and the dysfunctional effects of institutions. This is the theme of Albert Camus' La Peste. It's the theme of José Saramago's wonderful novel Blindness. And you can find this also in, for example, Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, where he describes a plague, probably typhus, in which a third of the population of democratic Athens dies, and in which there's a kind of, as he describes it, a great lawlessness that erupts from pestilence. And we can see on the negative side, Donatella has mentioned most of these, we can see the decadent effects on the spirit and the institutions of democracy. I would add to her list the way in which there are contexts in which geronticide has been allowed to happen. You know, the unnecessary premature death of aging citizens. This was very clearly at work in the early weeks in Britain. I escaped from Oxford in the early days of March, and at that point, in the calculations of numbers of people infected and the number of deaths, senior citizens' homes weren't even included. And we had also the grand spectacle of I think, Lieutenant Governor of Texas daring to say on television that grandparents in America, you know, should should consider the possibility that it's time up for them, and that they should, be willing to step aside to allow their children and grandchildren to have a positive future. Geronticide has happened, and it should be called by its correct name. Lots of scapegoating, to be sure. I think globally about this pestilence. It is a global pestilence on a scale much larger than the so-called Spanish flu 1918 and 1920, so that in India, Muslims are the target of, and continue to be the target of a government and a media that wants to treat them as if they were the Jews of medieval Europe, where we know thousands of Jews were murdered during the bubonic plague. I also think that part of the anti-democratic trends of this period are to do with the pro-business government policies. If you look at the large bailout of the American government under number 45, as I call him, I don't use his name. This $660 billion paycheck protection program. It was largely a grant to business at the expense of other organizations. This pestilence has exposed also on the anti-democratic side, it has exposed the poor quality of elected leadership. It's under these circumstances that prevarication, bullshit, lying, double talk has actually made the pestilence worse in democratic context. That's clear, I think, for the United States, and it's certainly clear for Britain. I also think that the size of the precariat, the increased size of the precariat, is one of the already visible effects of this pestilence. Probably the doubling, in many contexts, the doubling of the size of people who live precariously, who do not have a secure job. They have no trade union. They have very limited, if any, future pension arrangements, and so on. They are among the victims of this pestilence, and we shall see whether they are protected through new social policies. We also, on the negative side, see the postponement of elections, of referenda, as in Chile, and the complication and possible corruption of elections. That has been the strategy from the beginning of number 45, to try to ruin the credibility, the legitimacy of an election by saying that all mail-in ballots are fake and fraud and riddled with corruption. I also think that it hasn't been mentioned, and it's perhaps the biggest factor of all to do with the future of democracy, and it's the China question. China, of course, has been, in certain contexts, part of the outgrouping, calling it the China virus. The point is that, and it's a great irony of this period of pestilence, which a Pfizer drug will not immediately solve. The great irony is that the country that hatched the virus in Wuhan is the country that is the first to stand up, as many parts of the world are still down on their knees. China is the great winner of this pestilence. That is a descriptive statement. And I speak with some experience about this. I am writing on China at the moment. I was actually teaching in Wuhan summer school in August of last year, and visited the market where probably this pestilence began. It's a very complicated story concerning China. At first, the party system clamped down on the medics and tried to conceal the eruption of this new virus. And it did so because Chinese New Year was coming, because there were two major party meetings in Hubei province, and they effectively tried to censor all information flows until roughly the middle of January. And then the China model kicked in, down came the gates crashing down. A whole city of 12 million people is locked down. A province is locked down. Various other parts of the country are locked down. And the consequence was that the virus was contained. And the data is probable. The application of a form of emergency rule, despotism, actually got on top of the pestilence. And so China is now in a phase where restaurants, clubs, public spaces are open. The domestic airline industry is at a higher level of flights than it was a year ago. The significant figure, unprecedented, is that in the period of the pestilence until the end of September, 30% of global GDP was generated in China. The economy is back. And this is not altogether good news for Democrats, because this system, China, put simply, is a phantom democracy. Lots of talk of the people and lots of experimentation with democratic tools, but it is a one-party system. It is a top-down system of power, and it is the big victor of this pestilence. That's the negative side, so to say, and in sympathy with Donatella and against the temptation of fracassomania, I would like to say, just in closing, a few words about the countertrends. So far, it hasn't been mentioned, but seems to me to be critical, that if you look at the democracies that have handled this pestilence with a strong measure of openness, in several cases without emergency rule, with a strong sense of solidarity of citizens, of trust of citizens in elected leadership, then it's important to look at Taiwan, South Korea, New Zealand, Uruguay, and Australia. It's interesting geographically that there's a heavy concentration of these democracies in the Asia-Pacific region. And I think it foretells a future with the reemergence of China as a global empire, rivaling that of the United States. It foretells the consolidation of the shift of power to the geopolitically, geoeconomically to the Asia-Pacific region. If you look at these various cases, they have qualities in common. Medical advice is listened to. In Taiwan, a new body had been set up some years earlier called the Central Epidemic Command Center. Daily press briefings where the chief medical officers elected from the regions of Taiwan, the chief medical officers stand side by side with the Minister of Health and explain what is known and what is not known, and how best to handle the pestilence. Governments in these cases engaged in mainly clear messaging, no lying, no bullshit, no mixed messaging of the Boris Johnson kind. And the consequence was, particularly when there had been preparations, as in Taiwan, with lots of PPE and so the consequence is that the level of trust of the civil society, of the structures of government, is very high. So solidarity came relatively easily, and the data then speaks for itself. Very comparatively, by global standards, very low levels of infection and very low rates of death. I think, in short, there is a democratic model for handling this pestilence. Whether it can gain traction, whether, for example, Biden with a task force could restructure the American public policy and win greater trust of the population, remains to be seen. But there is an alternative model in which, in short, to put it very simply, emergency rule wasn't necessary. It's not a necessary condition of handling this pestilence. On the positive side, if I may just, please cut me off if I am going too long. I think that there are signs of the strengthening of social solidarity. I don't like the phrase in English of social distancing. I think physical distancing is a more apt descriptor. I think there has been signs of the renewal of a sense, in many contexts, of the codependence of people upon one another. South Africans speak of Ubuntu. This means I am only I because of you. The respect for nurses, for ambulance drivers, for doctors, for supermarket workers, for delivery people. That is, there has been, I would say, a net increase in the sense of solidarity, and that strengthening of civil society is a very basic condition of possibility of democracy. I think finally I wanted to say something about two topics: expertise, Donatella mentioned, and I want to say something about monitory democracy. About expertise, I think in the positive cases that I mentioned, Taiwan and Uruguay and New Zealand, for example, experts have played a very important role, and there is a generic lesson here. What is an expert? Here, there's a long history of tension between expertise and democracy. The word enters European languages in the early 19th century, expertise, and it's hostile to popular power. That's why, for example, John Stuart Mill could recommend multiple votes for people with university education. So the expert was seen in that period historically as a weapon against popular power, because the people are ignorant, stupid, foolish. What is interesting is that sometime in the 1930s and until today, here I refer to Niels Bohr, the Danish quantum thinker, who redefined expertise. And I think we've seen its importance in this pestilence. The expert, the real expert, is someone who reminds their colleagues and reminds people of power and publics that they do not know everything. The expert is experienced. It shares a common root meaning. The expert warns against recklessness, against ignoring, the wearing of masks, etc., etc. And I think that in this respect, democracies, healthy, robust, resilient democracies in all domains of civil society, government and intermediary bodies need expertise in this sense. And I think it's one of the lessons, and I would say positive lessons, of this pestilence. Finally, what is democracy? We haven't put that question clearly on the table. It is, of course, about elections, periodic free and fair elections. And we see postponement, we see disruption, we see attempted wrecking of elections. But my prediction would be that the pressure for elections with integrity will continue, and it will grow as a consequence of this pestilence, despite whatever emergency rule arrangements there are. That's one meaning of democracy. But democracy, as I've tried to argue from 1945, has undergone an historic transformation. It means nothing less than free and fair elections. It is something much more. And I finish on this thing. There's something much more. It's the building and protection of monitoring, public scrutiny, public accountability institutions. I call this democracia monitorizada. I think it was born of the 1940s. It requires free and fair elections, but it's something much more. And this pestilence, I think, has actually seen, despite the bullshit and the lying and the incompetent leadership and the pro-business and the outgrouping, all of those negative trends, I would say that in contrast to the last great global pestilence, the so-called Spanish flu, which was probably born in Kansas, that was a pestilence, news about which it came to be called the Spanish flu, because that was the age of the steamboat, of the telegraph, of the slow motion reporting by newspapers of the pestilence. This pestilence is entangled in the era of communicative abundance. Time-space differences of messaging have been reduced to zero. And as a consequence, actually, it's a great paradox of this period. I would say there is a flourishing of the public monitoring of governments and of figures and of possible solutions of the downsides of this pestilence. There's a much qualitatively greater level of visibility, and that seems to me to be a hopeful sign. In this period of pestilence, to be optimistic is foolish, but to be pessimistic is to be disabling. Avoid fracassomania, and I would say pay attention to these dialectics that are remarkably complex and should induce a sense of wonder about the historic significance of this moment. But of historic significance it is. Gracias.
Well, thank you, John. I really like your perspective on bringing Albert Hirschman and his notion against fracassomania, this obsession, this absurd faith of the pessimist that things always go wrong. And what I would like to say, we have a couple of minutes more, is that what I think is fascinating in intellectual terms in this health crisis is that somehow the world has become a laboratory, not only because everyone's looking for a vaccine, but because we are testing societies, we are testing health services throughout the world, we're testing leaderships, we're testing regimes. And you were talking, John, about what we have to learn about the countries that have been successful in dealing with this emergency. And you talked about what are the common elements that you see in the different countries that have been exemplary in dealing with the health emergency. But I would like to pose a question to both of you in terms of that I see also another element that I think is relevant. If we take a look at Taiwan, if we take a look at New Zealand, Germany, Finland, Denmark, Norway, we see another common element. We see women in charge. We see women as presidents, chancellors, prime ministers, making the decisions, coordinating these experts, delivering a clear message. Is there something that we should be studying in terms of women's type of leadership as a new source of democratic effectiveness after the pandemic? I don't know if any one of you can take this issue, can comment in this issue.
I'm
Yes,
sure that Donatella.
if you wish, I can start. My impression is, and I agree with most of the things that John said, that we have to reflect on countries that have been more successful. Female leadership has been one of the elements that have been pointed at, but I think we have to consider that even if there was, there is a tendency to believe that all countries behaved in the same way, lockdown and so on. In the reality, there have been different policies and policies that built on different conditions. So I think that the countries that succeeded more in keeping with solidarity and in reducing the spread of the pandemic are also those countries in which public health systems were stronger, in which labor rights were stronger, and in which there was more mobilizations of the civil society. So same policies to a certain extent, but quite different on the other side. I think we have to wait until the end to say who succeeded and who failed, but we already know that the three most failed attempted control of the pandemics were United States, Brazil, and the UK, where a certain type of leadership developed. So very machos, very authoritarian, very populist, and so on. I think this is important. Just wanted very briefly to mention 2 points. One is that we have to consider that
five more
life
minutes, please. I'm sorry, but we just have 5 more minutes, Donatella. So if you can wrap it up so we can hear John's final comments.
Okay.
Thank you.
I think.
Did you have something else to say, Donatella? I don't want to just cut your argument.
No, it's okay. It's okay.
Okay, thank you very much. John.
Well, again, I agree with Donatella and Jesus. I think it's a very pertinent question about the gendering, so to say, of this pestilence. And I think it is not a coincidence that figures like Tsai Ing-wen in Taiwan or Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand are winning elections and actually have commanded very significant quantities of citizen trust. Why? The leadership style is against machismo. It's against the Bolsonaro, the number 45, the Boris Johnson laziness and self-assurance. It is instead a different anti-demagogic style of leadership. Demagogy, the caudillo is a pest. It is an ingredient of the pestilence as Daniel Defoe famously said, bad people in the pestilence are part of the pestilence. It's also in the poetry of Percy by Shelley. And instead, you see, for example, in these two women, despite all of the differences of context, you see that there is a significant capacity for empathy, the willingness to listen to others, to try to understand what the medical experts are telling them and what people citizens are telling them about their sufferings. A level-headedness, a kind of ability also to mock themselves, to satirize themselves. I mean, that gives a whole new meaning to democratically elected leadership. It's in very short supply in this, it has been in this pestilence. And it does seem to me that not somehow because of genes, but because of learned behavior, these women leaders and many women chief medical officers in all kinds of global contexts display a certain radiance of style, a certain alternative form of leadership that actually really counts in this pestilence. It's a basic condition of getting beyond this pestilence without destroying democracy.
Very much, Donatella. John, these are issues that we are going to be discussing for many, many years because this pandemic will definitely change society, politics, economics, the sense of solidarity. So there's a lot to talk and to study about this, the political lessons of the pandemic. Thank you very much. Gracias a todos. Buenas tardes.
Thank you.